Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
$699 US. $699 US. $699 US.
As someone who once spent a few years in the industry, I can tell you, game development is anything but easy. There's no shortage of circumstances that can absolutely derail a game's development. Be it company infighting, development hell, overambition, and worst of all, crunch. These things can strain a company's budget, drain the spirits of the people who labor over these games, and ultimately result in one big medieval mess. What if the accident waiting to happen doesn't happen? Sometimes, even with the deck stacked against a game, you get a miracle. That's the kind of game I want to talk about. The kind of games that got immeasurably lucky, even with the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads by a hair. Now, one thing I need to make absolutely clear. I will never endorse crunch as a regular development practice. But hopefully this will help you appreciate what goes into the business, and why I believe these devs need unions. It's game time! Oh, Todd Howard, you snake oil salesman, your management style is as buggy as your game engine.
It just works.
No, Todd, you are not King Crimson.
Bethesda's history has been marked with bad DLC decisions, multitudes of glitches, and closing studios that they buy, and being purchased by Microsoft has just made things so much worse. Seriously, the guys at Krafton are the real ones for picking up Tango Gameworks after the fallout of initially being closed down by the House of Howard. This is a perfect segue, by the way, although we're not talking about Tango Gameworks this time. We're talking about Fallout. Originally published by Interplay as an isometric RPG, the franchise got picked up by Bethesda in 2007, and with Fallout 3, the franchise shifted to a first-person shooter RPG hybrid to great acclaim. And despite the fact that they had already begun development on the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim at the time, they still wanted to support the game, originally planning an expansion pack. However, Todd Howard, in his infinite wisdom, lobbied for a full game, and convinced Obsidian Entertainment to develop his project. Now, Obsidian was no stranger to Fallout, having been composed of devs who had been working on a cancelled Fallout sequel, and had experience with RPGs including Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Neverwinter Nights 2. Here's the issue. They were given just 18 months to complete the project, which is insane for a AAA title. Not to mention, the game was using the Gamebryo engine, which would become the basis for the Creation engine, which is a whole other can of worms. Not to mention, no one at Obsidian had experience with the engine, and they had to hire a modder for help. This could have been a recipe for trouble, but despite numerous glitches that had to be fixed, Fallout New Vegas ultimately ended up being a success, both critically and financially, with significant praise being given to its mechanics, story, and side quests, which some say were even more engrossing than the main story. Special mention has been given to the faction system, with how the various factions will respond to your actions, and the game endures as a cultural icon to this day. Now, if only the devs' bonuses weren't tied to a freaking Metacritic score! No, I am not letting that go, even as someone who doesn't play Fallout! Every Zelda fan has their favorite game, with Breath of the Wild, Ocarina of Time, and Link to the Past being common contenders. Of course, even the less popular titles deserve at least a mention in the conversation. Majora's Mask is a cult classic among Zelda fans, with its unique gameplay loop and interesting side characters, which lead to some side quests which are arguably more interesting than the main quest of the game. Which is quite fascinating considering that, at least in terms of appearances, much of the game is, well, an asset flip of the more famous Ocarina of Time, which was released less than 2 years earlier. That time frame alone pretty much explains that part of the development of Majora's Mask, but the full story is quite a bit more complex than that. Originally, the plan was to make a remixed Aura version of Ocarina for the 64DD, the N64's forgotten disk drive peripheral. Of course, there were two problems with this plan. One, the 64DD was a massive flop to the point where it never even left Japan. a failure that will come back later. The other issue with the idea was Eiji Aonuma himself. He wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of simply redesigning his dungeons for a remix version, and so Miyamoto gave him a challenge. New game, same engine, same graphics, 1 year. Under most normal circumstances, the regular response would likely be, "Are you insane?" But you don't say no to Miyamoto. Well, it took a little more than that 1 year to finish the game. The actual development time for Majora's Mask was 15 months. Even for an existing engine that the team knew, that is a crazy short time to develop a game. Let me give you a bit of context here. Ocarina of Time took 5 years to develop. Okay, to be fair, Ocarina's development time included developing the engine and assets, but still, that's a significant disparity. And with such a short time frame for development, that can only mean one thing. Crunch! Yep, that thing that all workers dread, and while we don't hear about it as much from Nintendo, there have been at least a few occasions. And the devs found a way to air their grievances through in-game NPC quotes. Even with all that, however, Majora's Mask still managed to win over both critics and fans, thanks in part to elements like its aforementioned 3-day loop and engrossing side quests, especially the Couple's Mask quest. In fact, some people believed it surpassed its predecessor. And as for Ura Zelda, another team ended up finishing that project for later release. You may know it as Master Quest. It must feel really good to be a Resident Evil fan right now. The RE4 remake has gotten widespread acclaim from critics and fans alike, having addressed several complaints from the original version. Was it needed? No. Did fans care? Clearly not. Of course, it helps that said original game was a big deal in the first place. Out of the Capcom 5, this one by far had the most success. There are many reasons for this, from the improved gameplay to the much improved voice acting and the characters and story in general. That being said, it went through quite a lot of hurdles to get where it got. Development actually began in 1999 for the PS2, and went through 4 different versions before going gold. Take 1, an action-oriented game written by RE2 writer Noboru Sugimura and directed by block-happy Hideki Kamiya. The idea focused on a new protagonist named Tony Redgrave, and ditched the previous game's fixed cameras and pre-rendered backgrounds. However, Shinji Mikami said it strayed too far from the series' roots. So as a result, it was rebranded, Tony would become Dante, and that's how Devil started crying. Take 2. Development restarted at the end of 2001 and moved to the GameCube. This version, nicknamed the Fog version, had Leon infiltrate the Umbrella headquarters and featured more traditional RE enemies. Also, Leon was infected by a virus that gave him superpowers. This version also featured an unknown girl, which may or may not have been the basis for you-know-who. Take 3. A third version, nicknamed the Hookman version, was featured at E3 in 2003. This version also had Leon infected with something, and had him dealing with supernatural enemies such as possessed armor, haunted dolls, and a ghost-like killer with a hook. This game also dealt with such things as hallucinations and flashbacks, making it more psychological horror than creature horror. Some elements, like the over-the-shoulder view, would make it into the final version. Take 4. This version, the hallucination version, only reached the story planning phase, with Leon infiltrating the Spencer Castle and an unknown girl waking up in a lab. There was also a BOW dog involved. Unfortunately, this version became too expensive to keep going with it, but some of its ideas were adapted into Resident Evil 5. Even when they got to the final version, there was a bit of internal conflict, with some of the staff being hesitant to change the way things were going with the series. It took Mikami's intervention to explain what he was going for, before things were even able to go forward. With all these changes and scrapped ideas, it's honestly impressive that the final product is as good as it was. That being said, if you have to scrap ideas to finish a game, it doesn't hurt to keep them in the archives. They might come in handy later. When it comes to the pioneers of first-person shooters, the first name that comes up is typically id Software. While there were technically FPS games that came before, it was id that came up with the games generally accepted as the grandfathers of the modern shooter. Whether it was Wolfenstein 3D for establishing the pace that successors would follow, Doom for laying the foundation for multiplayer deathmatches and the simulation of 3D graphics, or the game we're looking at here, Doom's successor, Quake. Building upon what Doom and Wolfenstein started, Quake offered a full 3D action game combining sci-fi and fantasy, and played a big part in the expansion of online multiplayer. It was also highly acclaimed for its crisp visuals and intense soundtrack, not to mention its weapons and gunplay. In spite of its success, however, to say that its development was troubled would not be an overstatement by any means. Like Resident Evil 4, Quake went through several incarnations prior to its final form. The first was a side-scrolling RPG of all things, entitled The Fight for Justice, with a main character named Quake. That idea was scrapped after 2 weeks of development. Then, in late 1994, development on Quake began in earnest after John Romero brought up the D&D campaign, but used that to pitch a first-person melee action game. John Carmack started to work on the engine, while the rest of the team started to work on R&D. Unfortunately, the engine took a lot longer than initially anticipated, but that part needed to be done before any of the gameplay could really be worked out. Working with an in-development engine, by the way, was anything but easy. A lot of level designs had to be redone, and much of the work had to be straight up scrapped by the time the engine was completed. Naturally, the team was pretty burned out by this point, so they suggested changing the project to a first-person shooter instead. Romero was opposed to the idea at first, but ultimately gave the okay, although these creative differences would lead him, and much of the team, to end up leaving id Software after the game was completed. As one might expect, the team's morale was running on fumes at this point, due to not only the creative infighting, but also the nasty levels of crunch they had to go through to finish. Romero called this one of the toughest grinds of his career, and he was the only one in the office on launch day. Honestly, I wouldn't have blamed anyone for staying home after going through what they went through. I'd probably be feeling like I actually went through hell. That being said, if it weren't for Quake, we wouldn't have TF2. The original Team Fortress was a mod for Quake. That alone should be an example of why we should be giving developers their due credit.
Not to mention reasonable amounts of PTO.
Remember when Square Enix was the go-to company for quality RPGs? I sure as hell do. It seems nowadays that Square Enix has become known for tone-deaf decisions like going in on AI, big-budget failures of live service games, and getting burned by exclusivity deals with Sony. Ironically, it's because of Sony that Square was able to complete arguably its most beloved title of all time. I am of course referring to the RPG juggernaut that Squeenix can't stop loving, Final Fantasy VII. For everything this game did for RPGs and for gaming as a whole, however, you may be surprised at the number of hurdles it had to jump over in order to cross the finish line. This was a game whose development spanned not only years, but entire consoles. Talks for this legend started almost as soon as Final Fantasy VI was fresh out of the oven. In fact, it was originally conceived as another 2D game, with development of a prototype on the Super Nintendo. Of course, following the original prototype, the team put development on hold to help with completing yet another masterpiece. That, of course, was Chrono Trigger, which they should fix the issues with the PC port and bring it to consoles already. Anyways, so after that was done, talks picked up again in 1995, but by this point, technology was advancing, and the debate was whether to continue with the 2D plans or shift to 3D as the market was progressing towards. After deciding to roll the dice on 3D, Square narrowed down the choice of console to between the Nintendo 64 and the fledgling Sony PlayStation. They tried making a version on the N64, but you can probably see why that didn't pan out. Cartridges still had relatively faster load times, but dear lord they were getting pricey. They did experiment on the N64 with a test version that would have utilized the 64DD, and here's where things ended up falling out, not only with this version, but between Square and Nintendo. A rift that would last roughly a generation and a half. Not only were 64DD dev kits few and far between, but it was evident early on in testing that this was a bad idea. The 2,000 polygons needed to render the behemoth, an iconic Final Fantasy monster, put so much strain on the N64 hardware that the frame rate suffered. You know how many discs they would have needed to run the game properly? 30. And you wonder why the 64DD failed. So yeah, after all that, the decision was obvious. Square took their business to the PlayStation, and after all that experimenting, the final version was developed in just over a year, with a team of 100 to 150 people, which thank Palutena, because for a normal team, the crunch would have been unbelievable. But somehow, they delivered with a revolutionary RPG, which delivered a gripping story with several memorable characters, a legendary soundtrack, and a battle system that kept players engaged the whole way through.
And while we may never know the full extent of the reason that Nintendo backed out of the deal with Sony, one thing's for sure. They screwed themselves out of history that day.
When it comes to the Super Nintendo and the Mega Man franchise, the conversation is dominated by Mega Man X. Not even the original NES trilogy, just the original X. And to be fair, I don't blame them. But the classic series entries on the SNES tend to fly under the radar. To be fair, Mega Man Soccer is pretty damn weird, and the less said about Mega Man on bass, the better. But what about Mega Man 7? Honestly, I think Mega Man 7, BS Final Boss notwithstanding, is sorely underrated, and did quite a bit more than most people give it credit for. Its relatively cartoony art style was very appropriate for the OG, as opposed to the darker tones of the X series. It also brought the item shops from the last two Game Boy games into the main classic series, introduced parts where Robot Master weapons interact with the environment, had a hidden boss battle, introduced bass as a rival to Mega Man, and was generally a well-designed and well-executed game. Of course, the fact that it was even finished to begin with, let alone any good, is nothing short of a miracle, given the game's development window. To make a long story short, Mega Man 7 came during that time when Mega Man was an annual franchise. And annual franchises, by rule, have relatively short development times. Nowadays, the only annual franchises are things like sports franchises and Call of Duty, and those have their own problems I don't want to get into. Now back to Mega Man. As it turns out, the reason for Mega Man 7's ridiculously short development time actually had to do with the X games. Mega Man X was released in 1993, while X2 followed in 94. And Capcom needed a game for 95 due to what I can only assume was studio mandates, but also wanted to make sure the classic series wasn't neglected. As a result of this unfortunate timing, the team had to build this game from the ground up, with a new engine and new assets, in just 3 months.
Excuse you?
Yeah, an entire game, in 3 months! Forget AAA development nowadays, even in the 90s, that kind of development window is absolutely insane! And yet, according to interviews, the team's morale was surprisingly high. Keiji Inafune, who was the head artist at the time, as well as Hayato Kaji, the lead illustrator for the game, said that the team was really passionate about making this game the best it could be in such a short time. But as if the ludicrous rush wasn't enough, Capcom originally didn't plan to release the game in America, despite having an English translation ready, due to diminishing returns already starting to kick in. It only got an English release due to backlash. Good thing we did, because over time, more people have started to warm up to this game, thanks in part to the Legacy Collection. Of course, X3 was also needed that year, and as a result, the development on that game had to be outsourced to another developer.
You know, given that X3 has so much more jank than the first two X games, that explains a lot. Pokemon. We haven't even started and I can already tell this is gonna be a ride.
Look, the contrast between the characters and cool ideas that went into Scarlet and Violet and the glitches and technical issues that plague its existence is so glaring you'd have to wear shades to be able to handle it. Unfortunately, this is a common problem with rushed development cycles, which is why I'm relieved to see that Legends ZA is getting more time to cook. Funny how back when the originals were released, they were lauded as revolutionary for their time and would become a launching pad for a worldwide phenomenon and what would become the biggest media franchise in the world. Its simple formula and easy-to-understand mechanics made Gen 1 a hit. But you may be surprised to hear that troubled developments have followed the franchise from the egg it hatched from. Heck, the original idea almost never got off the ground. When Satoshi Tajiri originally pitched the idea, the higher-ups at Nintendo were pretty skeptical, and Tajiri wasn't even confident that he'd get the green light because his idea was so ambitious. You see, the thing you have to realize about Game Freak at the time was that their previous projects were much smaller in scope, ranging from puzzle games like Mendel Palace to action games like Pulseman. A game of this magnitude was far beyond anything they had ever done. Kind of crazy when you realize that Pokemon is what Game Freak is known for nowadays. But if it weren't for Miyamoto, who not only went to bat for Tajiri, but helped mentor him throughout development, it might have fallen into one of Team Rocket's pitfalls straight out of the blocks. Of course, given that Game Freak was a much smaller company at the time, this project was a huge strain on them. Overall, this game took 6 years to develop, a time frame which I kind of wish they had nowadays with the size they have now. And probably the biggest obstacle to the game's development was quite simple.
Because I'm all out of money!
The development of the original Red and Green was so taxing on Game Freak that it nearly bankrupted the company. Oftentimes, there was barely enough cash coming in to pay everyone. In fact, Tajiri was living off of his father's income at the time, and 5 employees even quit during the process. In fact, it was only thanks to the investment of another company that the project had enough to even get finished. That would be the third piece of the puzzle, Creatures Incorporated. No one would have expected this alliance to create such a juggernaut, but nowadays, the Pokemon franchise is as big as they come, with games, media, and merch up the wazoo. It's just crazy to think about just how close we got to none of it ever existing in the first place, let alone capturing the attention of children the world over. Just goes to show you that in this business, you gotta take big risks to make big bucks. And pray you don't hit a whammy. With the excitement for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond back in full swing, now that we finally know more about the game after 7 years of waiting, it's pretty safe to say that the Switch is the best thing to happen to Metroid in quite some time. I mean, we also have the excellent remaster of the original Metroid Prime, which is honestly one of the best games in the whole franchise. Even when it first came out on the GameCube, it was hailed as a classic, with Samus's first big mission in 3D. It was so immersive and atmospheric, and with so many innovations that let you take in the game's lore as you went. That being said, the fact that it turned out the way it did may as well have come down to a sacrifice of blood, sweat, and tears that I would never wish upon anyone. The game actually grew out of one of 5 projects that Retro Studios, founded by former Iguana Entertainment head Jeff Spangenberg, had received shortly after its founding. For the first 3 months, the game was planned to be third-person, but Miyamoto insisted on a first-person perspective, one of the reasons being the issues with the third-person perspective of Jet Force Gemini. This caused internal conflict between Miyamoto and Spangenberg and series producer Yoshio Sakamoto, a rift which eventually led to the resignation of lead producer John Whitmore. The development of Prime became such a high priority for Retro that all of their other projects ended up getting cancelled. As for Spangenberg himself, his tenure was a whole other can of worms. Employees reported that while he was in charge, he was rarely in the office, and between late 2000 and early 2002, he pushed off most of his work onto his employees without supervising them, which is something you cannot afford to do. This caused communications between Retro and Nintendo to suffer. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, in the summer of 2001, a website registered to a studio mailing address surfaced with Spangenberg hot tubbing it up with babes, which may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Nintendo bought out Retro from Spangenberg shortly after, and after being ousted, he would found Top Heavy Studios, the devs behind the Guy game. Yeah, to the surprise of absolutely nobody. Of course, that wasn't the end of the troubles for Prime's development, not by a long shot. Development of the game took 2.5 years, with much of that time being dedicated to laying the game's foundations. The first-person platforming took several iterations and ideas to get it just right. And when I say most of the time was spent on the foundations, I mean that 75 to 80% of the actual game was done in the last 6 months. The level of crunch in that final stretch was ungodly, resulting in 6 to 7 day work weeks with as much as 12 hours a day until the game went gold. 6 months of that would break just about anyone. With that much strife going on behind the scenes and the unbearable rush towards the finish line, the fact that Metroid Prime managed to turn out the way it did could only be described as divine intervention. And I won't say that one person nearly derailed the whole project, but if said one person actually took responsibility, oh, and wasn't such a sleazebag, I have a feeling that all of this crunch could have been avoided. Ah, Microsoft, how the mighty have fallen. And by fallen, I mean you dug the pitfall yourself, barely covered it up so that it was painfully obvious where it was, and still managed to fall into it. Did anyone honestly expect the purchase of ActiveBliz to actually change anything for the better? But there was a brief period of time where Xbox was as synonymous with gaming as the NES, PS2, and Atari. And no franchise better encapsulates the rise and fall of Xbox, quite like its once flagship series, Halo. As you may recall, the original Halo was a massive success for Microsoft, pushing first-person shooters forward on consoles like no game before it. So naturally, a sequel to Halo was very highly anticipated. Bungie hadn't even planned on making a trilogy, but with success came sequels, and Halo 2 built on its predecessor's success, mainly in pioneering many aspects of online multiplayer for console games. For all its successes and evolutions, however, it was nearly derailed by a whirlwind development which can be summed up in one word: over-ambition. The team at Bungie wanted to build a sequel starting with adding ideas that were cut from the original game. Then they tried to add everything else, rebuilding the game engine, changing the graphics engine, and, as they put it, tripling everything. They had plans for a huge squad-based multiplayer mode called Warfare, which was to be put alongside the familiar smaller-scale multiplayer, which was nearly removed. Things were troublesome early on, with Bungie co-founder Jason Jones being burned out just like with the original and jumping ship for another project, and fellow Bungie co-founder Alex Seropian leaving the company outright in 2002, leaving small groups working on the project that barely communicated at all, not to mention a serious void in leadership. Then came E3 2003 and the first gameplay trailer for the game. A trailer which, by the way, contained several elements that weren't ready for prime time. The whole graphics engine used in the footage needed to be scrapped, elements like vehicle hijacking needed to be scripted, and there was no playable build for a year due to the restructuring of the engine, and development got bottlenecked because assets developed by the teams couldn't be prototyped. It was clear that in order to finish the game, a lot of stuff needed to be scrapped. The whole single-player campaign was revisioned and left unplayable for more than a year. Remember that finish the fight cliffhanger? Yeah, that happened because a planned third act was cut. You know what else was cut? The massively ambitious Warfare mode. As it turns out, however, one of the biggest problems with Halo 2's development was the success of Halo 1. Microsoft was pinning the future of Xbox on Halo 2, and the execs were pressuring Bungie to launch the game for the launch of the Xbox Live service. And were it not for a walkout threat from the head of Microsoft Studios, Ed Fries, the team might not have gotten that extra year of dev time. Even with that extra year, the team went into the mother of all crunches so as not to miss the final holiday season before the launch of the 360. The fact that Halo 2 would be hailed as one of the best games of all time, and the first true blockbuster, is nothing short of miraculous given this insane development. Pray that you never have to go through this. Now before we move on, here are some honorable mentions. Street Fighter Alpha, a team of rookie devs in 6 months of dev time? Yikes. The King of Fighters 14, a relatively short development time with new assets and a brand new engine. Ace Combat 7, numerous delays to make things work, but they were used to make the game better. Crash Twinsanity, I wonder how good it would have looked if all the cut content would have been added in. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, 7 people, 10 months. Good luck, Takumi-san. And now let's see what the Arcade Nation has to say with this month's patron picks.
Crash Team Racing was made as a solo project by Naughty Dog after their contract with Universal had wrapped up, meaning they basically had no budget to work with. That, and they ended up trying to kill the IP with the main villain, Nitrous Oxide. What resulted? One of the absolute best racing games of all time.
It's a miracle that Doom 2016 is as good as it is considering of its development cycle, beginning as Doom 4 and eventually having to restart and become Doom 2016. I'm genuinely shocked that it's as good as it is.
With how badly it was doing financially, Fire Emblem was on its way out. But thank Naga that Intelligent Systems released Awakening, because with accessibility and quality of life improvements, as well as callbacks to previous games, it actually ended up being what saved the franchise in the end.
Looking back to its reveal at E3 1999, I doubt anyone was expecting the impact that Team Fortress 2 was going to have. It was originally supposed to be a realistic modern war game, but during the 9 years it spent in development hell, things changed drastically. Also add in the fact that Valve didn't release any information on it for 6 of those years, you've got a project most people dismissed as vaporware. And what will result of this chaos? One of the most successful games that Valve has ever put out. Wunderbar indeed.
Throughout this list, we've seen games go through numerous iterations and visions, internal conflict, development hell, trouble with executives, and insane levels of crunch. None of which any dev team should have to go through. Number 1, on the other hand, is the story of a game that beat the odds in a different way. How a fledgling team took an insane gamble and ended up hitting the jackpot. This is the story of Cuphead. A boss rush run-and-gun with an art style inspired by the cartoons of the 1930s, more specifically the cartoons of Fleischer Studios and Walt Disney, Cuphead has been a massive success on pretty much every modern platform. Its distinctive art style, which is one of the highlights of the game, its bop and jazz soundtrack, and its crazy hard boss battles have garnered widespread acclaim from critics and gamers alike. A game like this would have been a challenge for a regular dev team. But consider the kind of indie house that Studio MDHR was and still is, and the fact that Cuphead managed to accomplish as much as it did is like going all in against an opponent who uses loaded dice and still winning. This was a studio of rookies who had never published a game before, though the founding brothers, Chad and Jared Moldenhauer, had a love of games since early childhood. They actually attempted to make a game as early as 2000, but the technology at the time was too limited for their vision. But in 2010, a certain game would be released that would inspire the brothers to try again. That game was Super Meat Boy, a game that was one of the vanguards for the rise of indie games, known for its retro art style and crazy difficulty. The development of Cuphead began in 2010 using Microsoft XNA, a set of freeware tools that was used for developing games for the Xbox 360 and Windows at the time. In 2014, they would switch to Unity as the engine of choice. Quite possibly the biggest challenge for the brothers and their small team was the art style itself. After going through about 150 designs for the protagonist, Chad, who had experience in graphic design, animated all the characters in the game by hand. In an era where so much is done by computers, drawing and animating every character by hand is an insane undertaking, even with the 24 frames per second that was the standard of cartoons of the 30s, which Moldenhauer was emulating. Not to mention that the backgrounds were hand-drawn as well, and painted by watercolor. Think about that for a second. With computers, mistakes are usually fixable. You can move this sprite up a bit, or move this bit to the left a bit. When it's hand-drawn, on the other hand, changing an animation in the slightest way can result in a lot of work. The game was first revealed at E3 2014 and playable at E3 2015. After seeing such an ambitious and beautiful game on display, gamers were hyped. That's what convinced the Moldenhauer brothers to go all in. They quit their jobs and remortgaged their homes in order to finance the game's development and expand the team. Unfortunately, this gamble nearly backfired spectacularly. When people learned that it was a boss rush game with very little platforming, people began to lose faith in the game. That resulted in a bit of course correction. The resulting additional development of the run-and-gun stages ended up delaying the game by several years. But despite this additional challenge, the team managed to deliver one of the most visually striking and engaging indie games ever. And this is without any of the crunch that we saw with some of the previous games. In fact, with the DLC for the game, The Delicious Last Course, they delayed the release of it to make sure they could avoid that crunch. While it might not have had the same kind of issues that the other games on this list had, for such a small team to accomplish so much with the deck stacked so squarely against them, Cuphead has more than earned this #1 spot. I don't think even the devil himself could have seen something like this coming.
Of course, it's also a reminder of the inherent risks that come with developing indie games. For every indie title that becomes a smash hit, there's about 100 that bomb. But if you manage your risks, listen to feedback where it counts, and generally not be an a-hole, you might just have a chance. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Blue Sky and Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon, and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.